Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're settling into something heavier than usual, a chapter of history that most people walk past without ever noticing it was there. We're going to talk about the Magdalene Laundries, the institutions across Ireland where women and girls were shut away for decades, put to unpaid work, and quietly erased from the lives they'd once had. Some were sent there for being poor, some for being unmarried and pregnant, some for being orphaned, or simply for being seen as a problem someone wanted to disappear. This isn't a topic I'm going to rush through or soften for comfort's sake. It deserves to be handled slowly, honestly, and with real care for the women whose lives it belonged to. Before we start, if you find something worthwhile in these videos, feel free to like or subscribe, but only if it actually means something to you. I'd rather have 10 people who care than 1,000 who don't. And a quiet thank you tonight to the person who wrote in asking for this story. Requests like that are genuinely what keeps this channel pointed in interesting directions, and I don't take that for granted. Now go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can, let a fan hum somewhere in the background, pull a blanket up, and let your body start to settle. Tonight, as your mind loosens and drifts, imagine a version of life where a young woman could step through a convent door on an ordinary afternoon and simply not come back out. Not for months, not for years, sometimes not ever. Who were the women behind those doors? What shaped their days? What did the air smell like? What did the silence sound like? And how did so many of them survive it with anything of themselves left intact? Let's walk through it together quietly and see what we find. To really understand these places, you have to start with the buildings themselves. Picture long gray structures set back from ordinary streets, convents with high windows tucked in courtyards, and at the center of it all, an enormous laundry room that never stopped steaming. These complexes stood in Dublin, in Cork, in Galway, and a dozen smaller towns besides, and from the outside they looked exactly like what a passerby expected a convent to look like. Solemn, orderly, faintly holy. Nobody glancing at the facade would have guessed what the walls were actually built to contain, because behind that respectable front was a separate world, closed in on itself, running by rules that the street outside never got to see. The walls did real work. They weren't decorative. Perimeter walls were built tall, sometimes capped with broken glass or iron spikes, so that even a glimpse of open sky from inside the yard felt rationed. Upper floor windows were often built or later modified so they couldn't swing fully open. Interior doors stayed locked between one section of the building and the next, and the only keys belonged to the sisters who moved through the halls like caretakers of a private, sealed kingdom. A woman inside might spend years never leaving a footprint outside a space you could walk across in a few minutes. The wash house, the dormitory, the dining hall, the chapel, the small enclosed yard where fresh air met a patch of sky boxed in by brick. Her old life, the street she grew up on, the shop she used to pass every morning, might be 100 yards away and still be as unreachable as another continent. What made this work wasn't only the stone. It was the reputation surrounding the stone. To everyone outside, a convent was, by definition, a place of goodness, women praying, women helping the less fortunate, women doing quiet charitable work nobody needed to inspect too closely. That assumption did more to keep people out than any wall could. Nobody wanted to imagine that behind a place associated with holiness there might be suffering, so nobody looked. A sound from behind those gates, if it ever escaped at all, was heard. If it was heard, as nothing stranger than the ordinary business of an institution doing its ordinary business. Inside, women learned fast that the usual markers of a free life simply didn't exist anymore. No front door to walk through when you felt like it. No street to wander down. No option of just deciding to go somewhere else. Time itself began to feel different, thicker, slower, without the little landmarks that normally break a life into days and weeks. There was no errand to run, no friend to visit, no weekend to look forward to. There was only the bell, the work, and the wall. Always underneath everything, the wall. So before we get into the labor and the silence and the years that stretched on without end, it's worth just sitting with that one fact for a moment. The fact of being sealed in, because everything else in this story grows out of it. It starts with a line drawn between in and out, a line that thousands of women crossed and were never again permitted to cross back. To understand why women ended up on the wrong side of that line at all, we need to look at where these institutions came from, and at the idea of rescue that gave them their original shape. These homes took their inspiration from Mary Magdalene, the biblical figure who tradition, more than scripture, honestly, turned into the archetype of the reformed sinner, the woman washed clean of her past. That was the founding idea behind these institutions when the earliest of them opened, back in the 1700s. They were meant to be shelters for women who had been involved in prostitution, places where a woman could find safety, learn a trade, and eventually walk back out into ordinary society with her name restored. And in the earliest decades, that's genuinely closer to what happened. Women came in and out more or less on their own terms. There was real charity in the original impulse, a desire to lift somebody up rather than lock her away. If the story had stayed there, this would be an entirely different kind of episode. But slowly, without any single dramatic turning point, the character of these places shifted. The doors that had opened both ways began, one by one, to open only inward. The population inside stopped being limited to women who'd chosen to come for help and started including women delivered against their will, for reasons that had nothing to do with the original mission. What had been framed as temporary reform hardened into something close to permanent confinement. And the name Magdalene, which had once been meant as a promise of mercy, became instead a kind of brand, a mark that could follow a woman for the rest of her life, whispered about, never quite washed off. There's a real irony sitting at the center of all this. The saint the institutions were named for was, in the tradition that inspired them, a woman who was forgiven, welcomed, restored. The places built in her name did something closer to the opposite, holding women in shame rather than releasing them from it, taking their labor rather than offering them a future. That gap between the promise in the name and the reality behind the walls is, in a lot of ways, the whole tragedy compressed into a single word. Understanding the origin helps explain how ordinary people could build and run these places while still believing, or telling themselves they believed, that they were doing something good. But belief alone didn't fill the dormitories. To understand how these institutions came to hold so many women, we need to follow the actual roads that led there, roads that almost none of the women walked by their own choice. There was rarely just one path in. Some women were brought by their own families in secret, usually because an unmarried daughter had become pregnant, and the household couldn't bear the shame of it becoming public. Some were sent along by a parish priest who'd heard whispers about a girl who was too much for a small town's comfort, too outspoken, too pretty, too visible. Some arrived from orphanages, simply transferred once they aged out of one institution straight into another, never once asked what they might have wanted for themselves. Some came by way of the courts, and some came because there was, quite literally, nowhere else for them to go. What tied all these paths together was the same thing. Almost none of these women made the decision themselves. Somebody else decided, and the gate closed behind a life the woman hadn't agreed to leave. Take the most common case, an unmarried woman found to be pregnant. In the social climate of that era, news like that could hit a family like a bomb going off. Reputation was everything in a small, tightly watched community, and a visible pregnancy outside marriage threatened to undo years of a family standing among its neighbors. Rather than face that, many families chose the quieter option: make the daughter disappear before anyone outside the household had to know. A conversation with the priest, an arrangement with a convent, and the daughter would be gone. Sometimes told she'd be back in a few months, sometimes told nothing at all. For a great many of these women, a few months turned into years or turned into the rest of a life. Other women came by a colder, more mechanical route, passed from one institution to the next like a file being transferred between departments. A girl raised in an orphanage, having known no home besides institutional walls her entire childhood, might simply be moved on once she reached an age where the orphanage no longer wanted her. She went straight from one set of locked doors into another, her whole life a chain of enclosures she never once had a say in. And then there were the referrals dressed up in the language of protection. A girl thought to be too flirtatious, too rebellious, too visible in a way that unsettled the adults around her, could be sent away by a parent, a priest, or a magistrate under the justification that she needed to be kept safe, or, just as often, that the community needed to be kept safe from her. Either way, nobody asked the girl herself what she thought. Adults decided her fate somewhere above her head, and she found out only once the decision had already been made and the door had already shut behind her. And finally, there were women who came for the plainest reason of all, because they had nowhere else to turn. No family, no income, no roof. For these women, the laundry wasn't a punishment so much as a last resort, though the price of that shelter turned out to be steep. Years of unpaid labor and a freedom that quietly disappeared the moment she walked through the gate. However a woman arrived, that first day marked a hard break in her life. The day before, she'd had a name, a family, a future she could still picture for herself, however uncertain. The day after, she stood inside a set of walls, and the very first thing taken from her, before the work, before anything else, was her own name. New arrivals were often assigned a different name almost immediately. Sometimes it was the name of a saint. Sometimes it was simply a number stitched into a uniform. Whatever it was, she was told plainly, "This is who you are now." Her own clothes were taken and replaced with the same plain uniform every other woman wore. In some institutions, her hair was cut short without her being asked. The official explanation, if anyone bothered giving one, was humility, a stripping away of vanity, a clean slate for a better self to grow into. But to a frightened 17-year-old standing in a cold entryway being told the name her own mother gave her no longer applied, the word humility didn't come close to describing what was actually happening. What was actually happening was closer to erasure, the quiet unmaking of a person before the actual labor had even started. A name is one of the very first gifts anyone receives, chosen before we can speak, spoken over us as infants, carried through every stage of a life afterward. To have it taken away reaches into something very deep in a person's sense of who she is. And yet this erasure was often the opening move of life inside the laundry. A woman who had answered to her name for 17, 18, 20 years was informed in the space of a few minutes that the name no longer belonged to her. From now on, she would be called whatever the institution decided. The stripping rarely stopped at the name. It arrived bundled together with almost everything else that had made a woman recognizable, even to herself. Her clothes, folded away and replaced by an identical uniform, meant that at a glance one woman could barely be told from the next. In some houses, hair was cut short, another small severing from the person she'd been just that morning. Piece by piece, the individual markers of a life were peeled away, until what remained was meant to be a blank surface the institution could shape however it wanted. The justification offered was always spiritual: humility, self-denial, the shedding of vanity so a purer self could take its place. And it's entirely possible some of the people enforcing these rules genuinely believed that language. But belief held by the powerful rarely softens what the powerless actually experience. For the young woman standing there, the fine spiritual vocabulary didn't change the plain fact of what was happening. She was being taken apart and reassembled into someone the institution found easier to manage. The deeper harm built slowly, to be addressed day after day, year after year, by a name that isn't your own is to feel the real self grow thinner and further away with every passing month. Some women held on to their true names privately, repeating them silently to themselves as a kind of anchor. Others, especially those who'd entered very young and stayed very long, described the strange sensation of the assigned name, eventually feeling more real than the one they were born with. In the most literal sense, the institution had renamed them. This unmaking didn't stop with names. It extended into the very air of the place, into a rule that touched something even more basic than identity, the simple human act of speaking to another person. Because in many of these houses, conversation itself was against the rules. In a lot of these institutions, silence wasn't just encouraged. It was law. Women worked 8 and moved through entire days without speaking, except during the narrow windows when speech was explicitly permitted. Talking was treated as an invitation to gossip, to complaint, to trouble, and so, across long stretches of the day, it was simply forbidden. Picture a room full of dozens of women, laboring side by side in heat and steam, and hearing almost nothing except the wet slap of cloth and the hiss of pressing machines. The intended purpose of the silence was reflection, penance, a turning inward toward prayer. What it produced instead, more often than not, was isolation, a loneliness that could sit right in the middle of a crowded room, and a hunger for even the smallest whispered kindness from the woman working an arm's length away. Silence itself wasn't unusual in religious life. Monks and nuns had long practiced periods of quiet as part of a life built around prayer, and there's a genuine spiritual tradition behind the idea that stillness of the tongue opens a path to stillness of the spirit. But there's an enormous difference between silence freely chosen by someone who took vows and silence forced onto women who never asked for any of it. In these laundries, the quiet wasn't an invitation extended to willing hearts. It was a rule pressed down on the unwilling, enforced through watching and through the threat of punishment, and it served the institution's interests every bit as much as it was said to serve anyone's soul. For the women themselves, the effect ran deep. The most natural human response to shared hardship is to talk about it, to make a joke, offer comfort, complain to someone who understands, build a friendship out of shared suffering. That's one of the oldest tools people have for getting through difficulty together. To have it taken away meant women were cut off from each other even while working shoulder to shoulder for hours every single day. A woman might stand at the same washtub as the same companion for years and know almost nothing real about her, because the words that would have built that friendship were never allowed to pass between them. The sound of an ordinary workplace is full of chatter, laughter, small talk that makes long hours bearable. The soundscape of the laundry offered almost none of that. Just the heavy, wet slap of linen, the hiss and groan of the pressing machines, the drip of water, the shuffle of shoes on stone floors. Human voices, when they came at all, came low and sparingly. To live inside that particular quiet, day after day, was to feel surrounded by people and profoundly alone at the same time, as though each woman had been sealed inside her own private silence. And yet the silence was never quite total, because the human need to connect doesn't crush that easily. Women found cracks in the rule and reached through them anyway. A glance held a beat too long could carry real sympathy. A word breathed under the noise of the machinery, timed for the moment a supervising sister's attention drifted elsewhere, could mean everything. A hand brushed briefly against another hand could say what the tongue wasn't allowed to say out loud. These small, forbidden gestures mattered enormously precisely, because they were so hard-won, tiny acts of tenderness and quiet defiance in a place built specifically to prevent them. The silence, in the end, was more than an absence of noise. It was a tool, a way of keeping women from comforting each other, organizing, or finding real solidarity. It made the days lonelier and the weight of everything else heavier to carry. And that weight, we should remember, was above all a weight of labor. Because whatever else the silence accomplished, the women were still there, day in and day out, to work in the enormous steaming rooms that gave these places their name in the first place. These places earned their name honestly. They were, in the plainest sense, laundries, large-scale commercial operations washing linen for the outside world. Hotels sent their sheets. Hospitals sent their bedding. Schools, army barracks, private households, all of them relied on this cheap, steady source of cleaning, and none of them thought too hard about whose hands were doing the actual scrubbing. It was heavy, punishing, physical labor. Sheets soaked in scalding water became enormously heavy the moment you lifted them. Steam thickened the air until it clung to skin and hair and settled into the lungs. Hands turned raw and cracked from harsh soap, year after year. And for all of it, every sheet, every hour, every year of a woman's working life, she was paid nothing. Not a coin. The income her labor generated went entirely to the institution, never to the woman whose body had earned it. This wasn't tidying up around the house. This was industrial-scale washing done entirely by hand, in an era before machines took over the heaviest parts of the process. Linen arrived in enormous bundles that had to be sorted, soaked, scrubbed, boiled, wrung, pressed, dried, and folded, every single stage drawing on a woman's raw physical strength. Wet cloth is shockingly heavy, and women hauled it for hours without pause. The cast-iron mangles used to press water from the sheets required genuine force to operate, and carried a real risk of crushed or mangled fingers for anyone careless or simply exhausted enough to slip. The room itself worked against the body in every way. Hot, wet, thick with rising steam from boiling vats and pressing machines, the air hung heavy enough that breathing itself felt like labor. Skin flushed, clothing stuck to the body, lungs pulled in moist, chemically laden air hour after hour. The soaps of the era were harsh enough to leave hands permanently reddened and cracked, and over months and years that toll compounded, aching backs, ruined hands, a slow grinding where that heavy labor always eventually produces in a human body. What separated this from the ordinary hard labor so many poor people endured in that era was the simple, brutal fact that these particular women received absolutely nothing for it. No wage, however small. No savings set aside. No coin a woman could call her own at the end of a decade of work. The linen belonged to paying customers. The payment went into institutional accounts. The women's hands did every bit of the work, and every bit of the value that work created flowed past them entirely, feeding the very system that held them captive. And this wasn't a small cottage operation washing a few extra sheets for pocket change. These were substantial businesses, competing seriously for contracts with hotels and hospitals and public institutions across entire cities, depending on that steady stream of trade to keep running. The clean, pressed linen flowing out of these laundries every single week represented thousands of hours of unpaid labor, and for the people running the institution, a wonderfully reliable source of income. In the coldest possible terms, these women were an unpaid workforce whose labor kept the whole enterprise financially alive. To really understand how completely this labor swallowed a woman's life, it helps to follow a single day from the very first sound of morning to the very last. Life inside these walls ran entirely on bells. A woman woke early, often well before sunrise, to a bell that marked the beginning of the day. Mass came first, then a sparse breakfast, then the long stretch of labor broken only by brief prayers and brief meals, all conducted in silence. The rhythm never changed. One gray day folded seamlessly into the next, with almost nothing to distinguish one from another. There were no true weekends, no holidays that felt like actual holidays. No sense that time was building toward anything at all. For a person used to even the small, ordinary freedoms of daily life, that flatness, that complete absence of anything to look forward to, became its own particular weight, a clock ticking endlessly without ever seeming to move toward release. The bell governed everything more present in a woman's day than any single human being. It woke her in the dark. It called her to prayer. It called her to eat. It called her to work. It sent her, eventually, to bed. Every ringing was a command she had no power to refuse, and her time, from the moment she woke, belonged entirely to someone else. The structure of the morning never varied. Rising, then Mass, religious observance always came first, and only after prayer did the first meal arrive. Then the long stretch of labor in the wash house, hour after steaming hour, interrupted only by scheduled prayers and scheduled meals, each one taken in near total quiet. Afternoon carried the labor forward. Evening brought more devotion before the day finally released a woman into her bed for a few hours of sleep. And then the bell rang again in the dark, and the entire cycle repeated, unchanged. That unchanging quality pressed down harder than almost anything else. Even a hard, poor, ordinary life carries small variations: errands, visits, festivals, the turning of seasons reflected in what a person does with her days. Inside the laundry, nearly all of that had been stripped away. Sunday might bring extra prayer, but little real rest and no real freedom. The feast days of the church came and went without ever becoming holidays in any sense a free person would recognize. One day dissolved into the next, almost without a seam. This sameness did something specific to how time felt. With so few landmarks to measure against, time lost its shape entirely. Weeks blurred into months, months into years, and a woman might genuinely struggle to say how long she'd actually been inside, because so little had happened to mark the difference between one stretch of time and the next. There was no sense of building toward anything, no project nearing completion, no date circled in hope on some future calendar. The bell rang, the work got done, and still nothing changed. That total absence of anything to anticipate was, for many women, among the quietest and cruelest features of the entire experience. Within this unbroken cycle of labor and prayer, meals were among the only fixed pauses in the day, small islands in a long gray stretch. But even these offered little real comfort, because the food itself was as plain and sparse as everything else about the place. Breakfast was typically porridge, weak tea, and bread. Food meant to fill a stomach rather than nourish or please it. Later meals leaned heavily on bread and potatoes, whatever cheap, filling staples the kitchen could prepare in bulk for so many mouths. There was little variety and even less pleasure built into any of it. Survivor accounts describe being frequently, persistently hungry, the food nutritionally thin, the portions never quite matching what a body doing genuinely hard physical labor all day actually needed. That hunger deserves real attention because it wasn't the dramatic crisis of starvation. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more corrosive, a constant low ache, a body slightly and continuously shortchanged, day after day, year after year. Layered on top of everything else these women carried, the labor, the silence, the confinement, that steady hunger added its own weight. Hunger doesn't only wear at the body. It wears at mood, at patience, at the spirit's ability to bear anything else that comes along. It sharpens every other misery it touches. Meals weren't the small refuges they might have been elsewhere. In an ordinary life, sitting down to eat is a moment of gathering, of ease, of conversation and small warmth. Inside the laundry, under the rule of silence and watchful supervision, meals were reduced to their barest function: brief, quiet, purely practical, finished quickly so the work could resume. Even this most basic of human comforts had been trimmed down to nothing but necessity. And when the long day of labor and its thin meals finally ended, women weren't returned to anything resembling a home. They were sent instead to large shared dormitories, and the nights held their own particular sorrows. Rows of narrow iron beds lined long, cold rooms under high ceilings, one bed indistinguishable from the next, the whole space carrying the unmistakable look of an institution rather than anyone's home. There was nowhere in such a room to be truly alone. No private corner, no door that closed. Privacy, one of those quiet dignities free people rarely even think to notice, simply didn't exist here. A woman undressed, lay down and slept in full view of dozens of strangers, and woke the same way each morning, always surrounded, never alone. The rooms themselves were cold, because warmth wasn't a comfort these institutions felt any particular need to provide. A thin blanket did little against a large stone room in the depth of winter. Women lay in the cold and the dark, bodies aching from a full day's labor, listening to the breathing and shifting of dozens of other sleepers around them. Not every woman inside these walls was fully grown. Many were still girls, some very young, and for the youngest, nighttime often brought the hardest hours of the day. In the dark, Once the demands of the day finally lifted, the full weight of everything lost could rise up all at once, and a girl might cry quietly for her mother, for her old bedroom, for an ordinary life that had simply been taken from her without her consent. To lie in a strange, cold bed surrounded by strangers, aching for a mother who couldn't come, is among the most desolate experiences a young person can carry. And it played out, night after night, in rooms like these across the country. Sleep, when it finally came heavily. Bodies work that hard don't stay awake easily. But heavy sleep isn't the same thing as peaceful sleep. Even in rest, the weight of the place never fully lifted, because waiting at the edge of every single night was the certainty that the bell would ring again in the dark, and that the day it summoned would look exactly like the one that had just ended. There was no morning to genuinely look forward to, only the resumption of the same unchanging cycle. To fall asleep already knowing precisely what tomorrow would bring, and knowing it would bring nothing new whatsoever, drained even rest of its usual comfort. Over the labor, the meals, and the long confined nights, one more presence shaped every single hour, an unrelenting schedule of religious devotion that governed the days as thoroughly as the bell itself. Prayer filled the day from its first minute to its last. Mass opened the morning, and from there the hours were punctuated again and again. Prayers before labor, prayers after it, the rosary repeated over and over, small devotions marking each transition of the day. On its own, this wouldn't be unusual for a religious community. Convents naturally organized their time around worship. But the women inside these laundries hadn't chosen a religious vocation. For them, this ceaseless round of devotion wasn't a freely embraced calling. It was a further demand laid on top of already exhausted bodies, woven so tightly through the day that almost no hour passed untouched by it. The content of much of this devotion carried real weight. Women were reminded constantly and by design that they were there to atone for a child born outside marriage, for a reputation the community had judged harshly, for circumstances that were, in most cases, entirely outside their control. Day after day, the message repeated, "You are fallen, you need purification, and your confinement here is itself a form of mercy meant to save your soul." For some women, genuine faith offered something real amid all this. A private inner room the institution couldn't fully reach, a sense of being seen and loved by something larger even when the people around her offered nothing of the sort. It would be wrong to pretend faith brought only suffering. For some, it brought real consolation. But for many others, the endless devotion became just another burden stacked on top of already punishing physical labor. A second shift, demanded of bodies and spirits that had nothing left to give. Told repeatedly that they were guilty, and that this guilt required atonement, some women came to feel that even their inner lives had been claimed by the institution, that no part of the day, waking or praying, truly belonged to them anymore. That, in the end, was perhaps the most powerful and most troubling thing about the constant devotion. It reached past behavior and aimed straight at belief, trying to convince women that their confinement was just, that gratitude rather than anger was the appropriate response, that the loss of their freedom was somehow a gift rather than a theft. And the people best positioned to enforce that message, hour after hour, day after day, were the women who ran these institutions, the sisters whose authority touched every corner of daily life. These laundries were run by orders of Catholic nuns, communities of women who had themselves given up ordinary life for religious vocation. It would be far too simple to paint every one of them with the same brush. Some were genuinely harsh. Some were simply indifferent, moving through their duties with little thought for the inner lives of the women in their charge. And some, according to survivor testimony, showed real moments of kindness inside a system that allowed very little room for it. But whatever any individual sister's temperament, the structure itself handed these women enormous power over the ones in their care. Power over food, movement, contact with the outside world, and critically, over how long a woman stayed at all. And power held over the powerless, however innocently it might begin, has a way of hardening over time. The sisters running these institutions had themselves renounced ordinary life, entering their orders young and binding themselves to vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their world was, in its own way, enclosed too, shaped by strict rules, long silences, and constant prayer, though the terms of their enclosure differed enormously from what the women in their charge experienced. To understand these institutions honestly, it helps to hold both truths at once. The people running them weren't distant, cartoonish villains. They were women shaped by the same walls, for the most part genuinely convinced that what they were doing served God and helped women they saw as fallen. Survivor testimony bears this complexity out. Nobody describes a single, uniform cruelty. Some sisters were harsh, quick to punish, slow to soften. Some were simply indifferent, administering the institution without much thought for what any individual woman was going through. And some, by the women's own accounts, offered real moments of gentleness, small human warmth that stood out precisely because the setting allowed so few of them. The truth, as it usually is with people, was varied. But whatever any single sister's character, the structure she operated within granted her extraordinary control. It was the sisters who decided what a woman ate and when, whether she could move between one part of the building and another, whether a letter reached her or was quietly set aside, whether a visitor was allowed through the gate at all. And most consequentially, it was often the sisters who effectively decided how long a woman would remain, since release depended so heavily on their judgment or their willingness to let her go. An imbalance of power this severe is dangerous in any setting, and over time it tends to reshape the people who hold it. Even someone starting out with genuinely good intentions, given near total authority over people who cannot answer back or appeal to anyone, sits inside a situation that erodes compassion and blunts conscience. When the people in your care have no voice anyone outside will hear, and no recourse if you treat them poorly, the ordinary social checks that keep human behavior humane simply fall away. Power over the powerless, however gently it starts, tends to harden the hand that holds it, and the closed world of the laundry offered almost nothing to soften that tendency. To see how this power actually bore down on real lives, we can turn to the largest single group of women it was used against: the unmarried mothers whose circumstances brought so many of them through these gates in the first place. A great many women sent to these institutions were unmarried and either pregnant or recently delivered. In the social world of that era, an unmarried mother carried a stigma so heavy that families, parishes, and the state itself often preferred simply making her disappear rather than offering any kind of support. She had broken a rule that the men involved were almost never punished for breaking themselves. And so she was hidden away, sometimes for the length of a pregnancy, sometimes for years afterward, her supposed shame treated as a stain to be scrubbed clean in the very halls where she scrubbed the linen of total strangers. Many of these women were barely more than girls. To understand why so many unmarried mothers ended up confined this way, you have to understand the world around them. A society where a child born outside marriage wasn't treated as a private misfortune deserving support, but as a public scandal touching an entire family's reputation. Neighbors talked. Standing in the community suffered. Families facing that kind of visible judgment often reached for the same solution: make the young woman disappear before the pregnancy became impossible to hide. She'd be sent quietly away, sometimes told this was temporary, sometimes told almost nothing at all. There's a deep injustice sitting right at the center of this arrangement, and it comes down to who actually paid the price. The young woman was punished, hidden, worked hard, marked for the rest of her life. The man who'd fathered the child faced, in the overwhelming majority of cases, absolutely nothing. He wasn't named. He wasn't blamed. He wasn't made to answer for his part in any of it. The entire weight of a shared act landed on one person, while the other walked away entirely untouched. A society that claimed to be protecting morality applied that morality to women alone, and let the men involved go completely free. And so the unmarried mother found herself behind the walls, her condition treated as a fault that needed working off. There's a grim symbolism sitting inside the labor itself, endless washing and scrubbing of other people's soiled linen, as though her own supposed stain might somehow be cleaned away through the act of cleaning cloth. Sometimes her confinement lasted only through the pregnancy. Very often it stretched on far longer, the temporary arrangement quietly hardening into something permanent. Perhaps the saddest detail of all is simply how young most of these mothers were. Not experienced, independent women navigating a hard situation, but girls, some of them very young indeed, frightened and alone, failed by the very people who should have protected them at the exact moment they most needed protecting. And for many of these mothers, the deepest wound wasn't the labor or the silence at all, but something that came after, the loss of the child whose arrival had brought her there in the first place. Within the wider system connected to these laundries, a network that included separate mother and baby homes, infants were frequently placed for adoption, sometimes with a mother's coerced signature on a piece of paper, sometimes with no consent sought at all. A woman might nurse her baby for a few short months and then simply find the child gone, sent off to a family she'd never meet, in a place she might never visit, without warning and often without a chance to say goodbye. Some of these women spent the rest of their entire lives wondering what had become of a son or daughter they'd last seen as an infant. The question of consent sits at the painful center of all this. In some cases, a mother did sign adoption papers, but the word consent rings pretty hollow given the conditions under which that signature was obtained. A young woman confined, dependent, ashamed, told at every turn that she was unfit, and that giving up her child was the selfless, correct thing to do, was in no real position to refuse. Pressure, spoken and unspoken, shaped what she put her name to. And in plenty of other cases, there was no meaningful consent sought at all. The child was simply removed. To lose a child to death is a terrible grief, but it's a grief that can, in time, be mourned to some kind of resolution. To lose a living child, taken and handed to strangers, is a different kind of wound entirely, one that never fully closes because it's never actually finished. The child is out there somewhere, alive, growing, becoming a person, and the mother knows none of it. Some women spent the whole rest of their lives imagining, wondering, quietly marking the birthdays of a child they'd last held as an infant and might never see again. That this was so often framed in the language of care for the child's welfare, for the mother's own redemption, makes it, if anything, harder to sit with. No amount of careful language could undo what had actually been taken or fill the space it left behind. As heavy as that grief was, it wasn't the only injustice woven into this system, because some of the girls sent behind these walls hadn't done anything at all except survive something done to them. Among the most painful truths of this history is that girls who had been abused or assaulted were sometimes treated not as victims deserving protection, but as sources of danger in their own right, as though the harm inflicted on them had somehow made them the risk. A girl considered too attractive, too visible, too likely to draw the wrong kind of attention could be sent behind the walls under the banner of protection, which in practice simply meant confinement. The logic ran completely backward, locating the problem in the person who'd been wronged rather than in the person who'd done the wronging. In a fair world, a girl who'd survived abuse would have been met with care and protection, and the person responsible would have faced consequences. That isn't what happened here. The harm she'd already suffered could itself become the justification for locking her away, as though she carried some contamination that needed containing. A girl who'd been preyed upon might come to be seen not as someone wronged but as someone dangerous, a walking temptation whose very presence posed a risk to others. The moral order got inverted entirely. For a young person, absorbing this must have been almost impossible to make sense of, to be harmed, and then removed from ordinary life because of that harm, all while being told the removal was for her own good. That combination taught a devastating lesson, that suffering doesn't bring comfort, it brings consequences. That being victimized can somehow make you the guilty party in the eyes of the people holding power over you. A lesson absorbed that young can distort a person's sense of her own worth for a very long time afterward. Many survivors carried, for the rest of their lives, the specific knowledge that they'd been imprisoned for something that was never their doing in the first place, punished for a harm inflicted on them, not by them. Behind all these individual injustices ran a colder, quieter logic that helped keep the whole system standing upright for as long as it did. A logic of money as much as morality. Because the women's unpaid labor was worth a great deal to the people holding the keys. It's worth pausing directly on the economics here. These weren't charities that happened to also do a bit of laundry on the side. They were functioning commercial operations, competing for paying customers, generating real revenue, and turning the unpaid work of confined women directly into institutional income. That revenue helped sustain the buildings, the orders, the entire operation. This is part of what makes the history so difficult to sit with, because it means confinement wasn't only about morality or reform. There was a genuine material incentive in keeping women inside and working. A reformed woman released back into ordinary life was, in the coldest possible terms, a pair of working hands lost. The incentive to hold on to her was quite literally built into the business model. This helps explain one of the most troubling features of the entire system: how women could end up confined for so long, well beyond any period that talk of reform could reasonably justify. When a woman's labor is financially valuable to the people holding her, and there's no wage owed and no outside authority forcing her release, self-interest tends to lean, quietly and consistently, toward keeping her exactly where she is. None of this means everyone involved was calculating in some cold, deliberate way, or that nobody genuinely believed in the religious mission. Belief and self-interest could and did coexist, each one reinforcing the other, the moral justification providing convenient cover for the material benefit underneath it. But the material benefit was real, and it shaped how the whole system behaved. A woman inside those walls was worth more to the institution working than she was walking free, and that fact leads directly into one of the cruelest aspects of what confinement actually meant. Unlike a prisoner, she had no sentence, no fixed release date, and often no way of ever knowing whether she'd be let go at all. A woman in one of these laundries had, in the overwhelming majority of cases, committed no crime and faced no trial, which meant she also had no sentence, no date circled on any calendar when the doors would open. Some women stayed months, some stayed years, and some, almost unbelievably, stayed for the greater part of their entire lives, arriving as girls and growing old within the same four walls, never once stepping back outside. Release depended on the will of the sisters or on a family member showing up to claim her, and for a great many women, that family member simply never came. Because there was no crime and no sentence, there was also nothing to serve out, no term that could be completed to earn her way back to freedom. There was only an open-ended present stretching forward with no visible edge to it. And should a woman resist any part of this, the labor, the silence, the loss of everything she used to have, the institution had its own ways of pulling her back into line. Discipline inside these places could be severe. Breaking the silence with even a whispered word, working slower than expected, showing open defiance, or attempting to run could all bring punishment down on a woman. Anything from the withdrawal of whatever small privileges she had, up through much harsher measures. Survivor accounts describe humiliation, isolation, and physical harshness used to enforce obedience. And because the outside world saw very little of what happened inside and asked even less, there was almost no accountability for any of it. That absence of oversight matters enormously here. What happens when nobody's watching, and the people being watched have no voice anyone outside will ever hear, tends to drift toward harshness unless something actively forces it otherwise. This isn't necessarily because the people in charge were uniquely cruel by nature. It's because the situation itself removed every ordinary pressure that normally keeps human behavior in check. The knowledge that you might be observed, judged, held accountable, all of that simply wasn't present here. Without something pushing back against it, unchecked power over people who cannot speak tends over time to bend toward the severe. It's no surprise, given all this, that some women eventually reached a point where they couldn't bear it any longer and took the enormous risk of trying to get out. Escape was difficult and genuinely dangerous, climbing walls, slipping through gates, ending up in a countryside or city where a woman had no money, no contacts, and often not even a name anyone outside would recognize as legitimately hers anymore. Worse, the world beyond the gates was frequently no ally to a runaway. A woman found wandering alone might simply be returned to the very place she'd fled, brought back by police, by a priest, or by her own family, who often saw her flight as further proof of exactly the waywardness that had supposedly justified locking her up to begin with. The knowledge that escape might only make things worse kept plenty of women from ever attempting it. And yet some tried anyway, again and again, refusing to simply accept where they'd landed. The physical act of getting out was hard enough on its own, the walls, the locked gates, an entire architecture built specifically to prevent exactly this. But clearing the wall was only the beginning of the problem. A woman who actually made it out found herself in a world where she had nothing. No money, because she'd been paid nothing for years of labor. No friends able to shelter her. No home willing to take her back in. Often, she didn't even have a name the world would recognize, having been stripped of her original identity the moment she walked through the gate years earlier. Crueler still, the outside world rarely offered the sympathy a person might expect for someone fleeing captivity. A woman found wandering without means was liable to be handed straight back to the institution she'd just escaped. This grim reality, that running might lead not to freedom, but simply to recapture, and an even worse standing than before, weighed heavily on any woman even considering the attempt. For many, that risk alone was enough to keep them from ever trying. They stayed, not because they'd accepted the walls, but because the world beyond them offered no safe place to actually land. And yet, against all of that, some women ran anyway, some more than once, after being caught and returned. Whatever the outcome, those attempts carry a meaning that goes beyond whether they succeeded. They're proof that the spirit inside these women was never fully extinguished, that something in them kept insisting on freedom, even when freedom seemed nearly impossible to reach. That refusal to simply accept the wall stands as its own quiet testimony to how stubborn the human will to be free actually is. Whether a woman ran or stayed, nearly all of them shared one experience in common: a deliberate, carefully maintained separation from the world beyond the walls. Contact with anyone outside was tightly controlled. Letters, on the rare occasions they were permitted at all, were read before being sent and read again before being handed over, meaning a woman couldn't write honestly about her actual circumstances and couldn't receive unfiltered word from the people she'd left behind either. Visits were limited, hedged with restrictions, or simply discouraged outright. For some women, the result was something close to total severing: parents, siblings, friends, an entire web of relationships simply fading into silence and distance. Months, sometimes years, could pass with no real news of the people she loved. This isolation wasn't accidental. It served a clear function. A woman cut off from the outside had nobody to describe her actual treatment to, no confidant who might object, or ask questions or press for information. And just as importantly, she had nobody on the outside actively expecting her, asking after her, insisting she come home. That absence of an outside advocate mattered enormously. When nobody beyond the walls is pressing for news, demanding to know when a woman will be released, the institution faces no external pressure whatsoever to let her go, or to treat her any particular way while she stays. Nor was this silence always imposed by the institution alone. Families themselves sometimes chose it, embarrassed by circumstances, ashamed of the reasons behind a daughter's confinement, or simply persuaded by the surrounding culture that she was better off left exactly where she was. They stopped writing. They stopped visiting. They let the connection lapse quietly, and the woman slipped from their active lives, remembered, perhaps, with discomfort or guilt, or in some cases not spoken of at all. Worn down by the years, by labor, and by isolation, the women inside were also vulnerable in their bodies. When illness or age caught up with them, the closed world of the laundry offered only uncertain care. The heat, the constant physical strain, the harsh chemicals, the cold dormitories at night, all of it took a cumulative toll. Medical attention inside varied enormously depending on the institution and the era. Some women received genuine care when they fell ill. Others suffered with very little. Aging women, worn down by decades of identical labor, grew frail in the same halls they'd first entered as frightened girls, and there was rarely any real notion of retirement or rest. A woman worked for as long as her body allowed. And when she could no longer work, she remained a resident anyway, simply unable to labor now, but no less confined than she'd ever been. And yet, for all of this, the women who lived through these places weren't only sufferers, passive and broken. Even inside a system built to strip away the self, they found ways to remain human to one another, and it's worth pausing on that before moving forward. A whispered joke exchanged the instant a sister's attention drifted elsewhere could lighten an entire hour. A crust of bread quietly passed to a frightened newcomer who hadn't yet learned to live with constant hunger was a gift far larger than it looked. A hand found in the dark of the dormitory and squeezed just once said everything the enforced silence wouldn't let a voice say out loud, that somebody else was there, that a woman wasn't entirely alone in whatever she was carrying. Out of small exchanges like these, real friendships grew, some of them lasting the rest of a woman's life, forged in an understanding that people outside these walls could never quite share. None of this undid the injustice. A shared crust of bread didn't fill an empty stomach for long. A whispered joke didn't open a locked gate. But that isn't really the measure of what these small mercies meant to the women exchanging them. In the moment, they mattered enormously: warmth against the cold, company against the loneliness, proof that a woman hadn't been fully reduced to a set of hands for washing other people's linen. There's something close to quiet defiance buried in that too. The whole design of these institutions worked to strip women of their individuality, to make them humble, obedient, interchangeable. In choosing to care for one another anyway, in insisting on tenderness where none was ever meant to survive, the women quietly refused that design and held onto both their humanity and each other. Some women held on that way for an almost unimaginable length of time, long enough that the walls became the entire world they knew. Among the most haunting figures in this history are the women who entered as young girls and simply never left, growing old across 50 or 60 years inside the same building. For them, the outside world transformed completely while their own days stayed nearly identical. Wars started and ended. Fashions and music and entire ways of living changed again and again. And still they rose to the same bell and walked to the same laundry room they'd worked in as girls. In effect, they became permanent fixtures of the institution, a long-term residence that newer arrivals might regard with a strange mixture of pity and dread, quietly wondering whether they were looking at their own future. For a very long time, most of the outside world simply didn't think about any of this. These institutions occupied almost no space in the public imagination. People knew, in a vague way, that such places existed, but nobody pressed very hard to ask what actually happened inside them. That comfortable silence held for generations, until something concrete and impossible to look away from finally broke it. And when the break came, it came, in a real sense, from the ground itself. In the early 1990s, a religious order in Dublin arranged to sell off part of the land attached to one of its properties. Buried on that land were the remains of women who had died while confined in a Magdalene institution over the decades. The sale meant those remains had to be exhumed and relocated, a routine, if solemn, administrative matter on paper. Except when the graves were actually opened, the numbers didn't match the records. There were more bodies in the ground than there were documented deaths on file. Gaps, discrepancies, women buried without their deaths ever being properly recorded, or recorded under circumstances that raised more questions than they answered. That mismatch between the dead in the earth and the dead on paper couldn't simply be explained away. It suggested women had died and been buried quietly, without the ordinary accounting any death should receive. And once that question got asked, it proved impossible to put back down. The discrepancies drew real attention, and attention brought scrutiny, and scrutiny opened the door to a much wider reckoning with what these institutions had actually been. There's something both fitting and sorrowful in how the truth finally surfaced. The living women had been silenced for generations, cut off, unheard, their experiences sealed behind these walls for decades. In the end, it was the dead who spoke loudest, whose disturbed graves and unmatched records simply could not be quieted. The women denied a real voice in life ended up compelling the living to finally listen. But these institutions never operated in isolation, and as the reckoning widened, it reached well beyond the convent walls into the families and the wider society that had made all of this possible in the first place. It's tempting to place the entire blame on the institutions and the religious orders running them, and they do bear a great deal of it. But these laundries couldn't have functioned the way they did without a much wider society willing to use them. Families delivered their own daughters to the gates. Neighbors gossiped and judged and made an unmarried pregnancy feel like an unbearable public disgrace. Businesses happily sent their linen to be cleaned at low prices and asked no questions whatsoever about whose hands were doing the cleaning or under what conditions. An entire culture agreed, mostly without ever saying so directly, that certain women were better hidden away than helped. That shared complicity is uncomfortable to sit with precisely because it spreads responsibility far beyond convent walls, out into the ordinary homes and streets of an entire country that allowed it to continue. Consider the families first. It was families in enormous numbers who delivered their own daughters and sisters to these gates. A pregnant, unmarried daughter, a girl seen as too much trouble, a sister who'd become inconvenient, brought by her own relatives and handed over. These institutions didn't, for the most part, go out and seize unwilling women from resistant households. They received women that families chose to give up. Which means the personal decisions made in countless ordinary homes across the country were themselves the mechanism feeding the entire system, its population. The wider community played its part just as clearly. Neighbors gossiped. Neighbors judged. Neighbors made the shame surrounding an unmarried pregnancy so unbearable that families felt they had no choice but to hide it. That intense social pressure didn't originate inside the convent walls. It came from ordinary people, from conversations over garden fences and glances exchanged on the street, from a culture of judgment that turned a private misfortune into a public disgrace. That pressure created the exact demand these institutions existed to meet. And there were the businesses and ordinary households that relied on the laundry service itself. Hotels, hospitals, schools, private homes, all sending their linen to be cleaned cheaply, none of them asking a single question about the conditions under which that cleaning happened. That incuriosity, that comfortable willingness to benefit without wanting to know, was itself its own quiet form of participation. These laundries needed customers, and an entire society was more than happy to be one. Underneath all of it ran a shared, rarely spoken assumption that certain women were simply better off hidden than helped, that an unmarried mother, a difficult girl, a woman who didn't quite fit should be put away rather than supported, removed rather than embraced. That quiet, widely held consensus, spread across families, neighbors, businesses, and the broader culture, is what actually made the whole system possible. The complicity didn't stop with private citizens, either. The machinery of government was woven into how these institutions actually operated, and that entanglement forms its own chapter in the eventual reckoning. Over the years, courts referred women and girls into these institutions directly. Public bodies did business with them, sending contracts their way and inspecting them lightly if at all. Later investigations made clear that the state hadn't merely tolerated these places from some comfortable distance. It had been genuinely entangled with them, sending women through their gates and quietly benefiting from arrangements that kept the whole system supplied and running. One clear thread of this involvement ran straight through the judicial system. A girl who came before a court might find herself directed not toward ordinary correction or care, but straight into one of these institutions, her confinement carrying the full sanction of the legal system behind it. Beyond the courts, public bodies did ordinary business with these laundries, sending their own linen to be washed and paying for the service just like any private customer would, all while providing essentially none of the oversight that might have exposed what was actually happening inside. When investigations eventually turned serious attention to all of this, the extent of state involvement became far clearer than it had ever been before. The government hadn't simply permitted these institutions to exist at arm's length. It had been an active participant, referring women, transacting with these places directly, benefiting from the arrangement, all while failing completely in its basic duty to protect the people confined inside. The state, in short, was a partner in the system, not a distant observer of it, which is exactly why the eventual reckoning could never be aimed at the church alone, however tempting that narrower focus might have felt. These institutions were sustained by a partnership stretching across families, communities, businesses, and government itself. A whole nation, through countless individual choices, that had built and maintained these places together. For all this reach and entanglement, though, these institutions did eventually come to an end, though far more recently than most people would ever guess. The last Magdalene Laundry in Ireland didn't close its doors until 1996. That date deserves real attention because it sits well within the living memory of most people hearing this story today. It's not the distant past. It's a year plenty of people remember clearly, a year of televisions, cars, and ordinary modern life continuing right alongside an institution that had been operating in essentially the same form for well over 2 centuries. These weren't medieval relics tucked away in some distant historical chapter. They persisted, quietly, hidden in plain sight, well into genuinely recent memory. When that final laundry finally shut its doors, it drew a line under an extraordinarily long history, one stretching back to the 1700s and surviving, almost unchanged in its essential character, into the modern age. Few institutions of any kind last that long, and the fact that this one did says a great deal about how deeply rooted it had become, and how slowly the surrounding society moved toward reckoning with it. And critically, when the doors finally closed, the story was far from finished. The buildings emptied, but the women who had lived through them didn't simply vanish along with the walls. Many were still very much alive, stepping forward now into a world that had finally stopped confining them but hadn't yet fully learned to listen to what they had to say. It took extraordinary courage for those women to eventually step forward. As the institutions closed and the disturbed graves kept raising questions nobody could quiet, survivors slowly, carefully began to speak. Many came forward only after decades of imposed shame and silence. Advocacy groups formed to gather these voices and press a collective demand for 3 things that had been denied for far too long: acknowledgement, redress, and truth. To understand what that courage actually cost, remember what these women had spent years, sometimes entire adult lifetimes, being told about themselves, that their suffering was deserved, that they were fallen, guilty, in need of exactly the correction these institutions claimed to provide. That shame had been pressed into them relentlessly, until many had half absorbed it, carrying a private sense that whatever happened to them had somehow been their own fault and wasn't fit to be spoken about out loud. To come forward publicly meant standing directly against everything they had been conditioned for decades to believe. Their testimony, when it finally came, was painful both to give and to hear. Women described the labor, the enforced silence, the confinement, the lost names and lost children and lost years, knowing full well that speaking meant reopening old wounds and exposing themselves to public scrutiny all over again. That willingness to relive their own suffering, laid out plainly for a watching public, was itself an act of real generosity and strength, undertaken not just for their own sake, but so the truth could finally exist in the open, and so the same wrongs might, with luck, never happen to anyone else. Their collective pressure eventually forced an official reckoning. In 2013, a formal inquiry in Ireland examined the government's own involvement with these institutions and confirmed a great deal of what survivors had been saying for years. In its wake, the head of the Irish government offered a formal state apology, acknowledging both the original wrong and the long silence that had surrounded it for decades afterward. For some survivors, hearing that apology after so many years carried real, genuine weight, an acknowledgement they'd never fully expected to receive. A public recognition that what happened to them had been real, had mattered, and had never been their fault to begin with. For others, it arrived far too late, landing only after most of their lives had already passed, and after many of their fellow survivors had died without ever hearing it. For some, no apology, however sincere, could ever answer what had actually been taken from them. Words from a government podium can't return a stolen childhood. They can't restore years spent laboring for nothing. And they certainly can't bring back a child who was taken and handed to strangers, or fill the space that absence left behind. What the apology did accomplish, within its real limits, was an official admission that these women had been wronged, and that the fault had never belonged to them in the first place. The memory of these institutions has been kept alive not only through official reports and formal apologies, but through art films that carried the story to wide audiences, music written to mourn what happened, books and plays that brought these women's experiences to people who might otherwise never have encountered them at all. Art does something official documents simply can't. It asks a listener or a viewer to feel, even briefly, what it might have been like to live inside one of these rooms, and in feeling it, to refuse to let it be forgotten. There is a particular fitness in that, given how these women were treated while they were actually living through it. The entire design of these institutions worked to silence them, hide them, reduce them to anonymous labor that nobody outside would ever think to ask about. The persistence of their story in wider culture stands as a direct answer to that erasure. Every retelling insists, quietly but firmly, that these lives mattered, that the suffering was real, and that it will not be quietly forgotten simply because the institutions once intended it to be. So we arrive, finally, at what all of this leaves behind for the people who come after. It would be easy, and not exactly wrong, to call this simply a story of cruelty. There was real cruelty running through every part of it, but leaving it there would understand it too narrowly. The deeper lesson isn't only about the cruelty of particular acts. It's about how easily an entire society can decide that some of its members deserve less freedom and dignity than everyone else, and how ordinary, even respectable, that decision can be made to look from the outside. No single monstrous choice built these institutions. They were built and sustained by countless small, ordinary choices, families, neighbors, businesses, officials, each one in their own limited way accepting the idea that certain women could rightly be hidden away and used. The cruelty wore the face of the completely normal. That may be the most unsettling lesson this whole history offers. That grave injustice can be woven quietly into the fabric of entirely everyday life, one small, unremarkable decision at a time. And yet the story isn't only about the people who caused this harm or allowed it to continue. It's centrally about the women themselves and what they managed to remain in spite of everything. They endured what should, by any reasonable measure, have been unendurable years, sometimes entire lifetimes, of confinement, labor, silence, and loss. And through all of it, many of them held onto their humanity in a place expressly built to strip it away, caring for each other, remembering who they truly were beneath an assigned name, refusing in small ways and occasionally in large ones to be completely unmade. When they were finally free to speak, they didn't let their suffering pass quietly into silence. They insisted, against real resistance, that the truth be told. Their endurance and their eventual courage belong to this history every bit as much as anything that was done to them. To remember these women is to do more than feel a passing sadness about a wrong from the past. It's to make a kind of quiet promise about how we choose to live now, to stay alert to the walls we ourselves might build, or simply tolerate, around whoever a society currently finds inconvenient or shameful or easy to set aside. It's a promise not to look away, the way so many people once did, telling themselves it wasn't their business or their place to ask questions. That's the weight these women leave in our keeping. And in a strange way, it's also a gift proof that even in the darkest, most silencing places imaginable, the human spirit can hold on and can, eventually, be heard. So we come to the end of tonight's story, and it's a good moment to let your shoulders drop and your breathing slow all the way down. We've walked carefully and gently through a world hidden behind gray stone walls, a world of long enforced silences, of hands worn raw in steam, of names quietly taken and years quietly lost. We've sat for a while with the unmarried mothers, with the children carried off to strangers, with the girls punished for harm that was never their fault, and with the women who grew old at the very same washtubs they'd once arrived at as frightened teenagers. It was a heavy story, and there's no use pretending otherwise. And yet, running through all of it was something the walls could never quite reach. These women whispered small kindnesses to each other in the dark. They shared what little they had. They held on to who they really were, and when they were finally given the chance to speak, they made absolutely certain the truth was heard. Their endurance is the quiet, stubborn center of this whole story, proof that even in a place built specifically to unmake a person, something in the human spirit can simply refuse to be undone. So tonight, resting safe and warm, with your own name still entirely your own and your own door yours to open whenever you choose, let a soft thought drift out toward them, toward the women who were hidden and are now remembered, toward the ones who suffered in silence and whose silence, eventually, broke open into truth. History can be heavy, but it's also full of stubborn, quietly unbreakable people, and we're the ones left holding what they leave behind. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let your thoughts slow all the way down and drift gently off to sleep. Rest well.